What if I told you that a country could successfully achieve, 100% universal electricity, build this multi-billion-dollar international tourism engine, and drastically slash its birth rate, but at the exact same time,
Right.
leave nearly 40% of its educated young women entirely unemployed?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a statistical error.
Totally.
You look at those figures on a page and your brain immediately tries to correct them because they just violate almost every standard model of economic development we're taught.
Exactly. So today, we are opening up a sprawling stack of World Bank data on Jamaica. And we're covering the 1960s right up through the 2020s to figure out how an economic miracle on paper can hide, basically, a ticking demographic time bomb in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
For you listening, our mission today is to move completely past the curated postcard image of white sand beaches and luxury resorts.
Okay, let's unpack this because we have this massive 15-page academic breakdown, thousands of rows of CSV files, cross-referencing demographics, the macroeconomy, education, public health. Yeah, it's a lot.
It is, and we are going to decode this matrix to understand the raw structural engine of a nation in transition.
And we really have to approach this objectively because spreadsheets, I mean, they're essentially the aggregated objective record of human behavior over time.
Oh, yeah.
When you layer this data, you start to see the friction. You see what happens when state policy collides with household poverty or, when an environmental strategy contradicts an economic necessity.
So to understand how a paradox like the one I mentioned up top gets built, we really have to look at the raw material of the nation, which is the people. Where does this data tell us to start?
Well, we have to start with the edge structure, specifically a metric called the age dependency ratio.
Okay.
If you want to diagnose the economic potential of a society, you look at who is working versus who needs to be taken care of.
By the ratio of dependents, so kids under 15 and adults over 65, compared to the active working age population.
Exactly. And if we look at the historical data going back to the 1960s and 70s, Jamaica's young age dependency ratio was sitting at roughly 91%.
Wait, stop there, because that number really needs context for you listening. 91% means that for almost every single working age adult, there was nearly one child depending on them.
Yeah, it is an immense burden on a developing economy.
I can't even imagine.
Let's explain the mechanics of why that stifles national growth. When your young age dependency is at 91%, an enormous percentage of the wealth generated by the workforce is just immediately consumed by basic survival.
Right. Food, clothing.
The money goes to food, housing, basic, primary schooling.
So there's no surplus.
Precisely zero surplus. And think about how a nation builds wealth. It requires capital formation. People put their extra income into banks, and those banks lend that capital to businesses to build factories or modernize farms.
But in a 91% dependency scenario,
families have no extra income to deposit. So the banks have less domestic capital to lend. The entire economic engine is revving at maximum capacity just to maintain a baseline status quo.
But then, tracking the line graph into the 1990s and 2000, there is just this breathtaking plunge. That young age dependency ratio drops from the 90s all the way down to below 40% in recent years.
Yeah, it's a profound demographic transition.
That's massive.
It's driven by a sustained decline in fertility rates, coupled with increased child survival rates. So the society rapidly transitioned from large agrarian-style families to much smaller family units.
Okay.
And simultaneously, we see the other end of the spectrum shifting. The old age dependency ratio, which was historically low, around 7.7%, has steadily climbed to roughly 14%.
Because the people from that initial youth bulge are getting older, right? And life expectancy is generally increasing. So let's translate this into the microeconomy of a single household. Imagine a family for years. You have 5 kids. The parents are working double shifts, but every single dollar goes to groceries and school uniforms. They're financially exhausted.
Right.
Then, over a decade, the kids grow up, they get jobs, and they move out. Suddenly, the parents have their income to themselves. The grandparents haven't moved in yet, though, they're packing their bags.
That's a great way to put it.
But for this brief moment, the family feels rich. They can finally fix the roof, or invest, or save. This is what economists call the demographic dividend, right? Is this a permanent victory or just a temporary window?
It is a demographic dividend, but to answer your question, it is strictly a temporary window, and it's the most critical historical moment for any developing nation.
Why?
Because it is a period where the total burden of care is at its absolute lowest. You have a massive labor supply and very low consumption to production ratios. Economic theory dictates that national wealth should just explode during this window.
Right, theoretically.
Right.
But looking at the macroeconomic indicators in this data set, they didn't really catch that wave.
No, they didn't.
If you look at the GDP annual growth rates during these critical transition decades, the line is highly volatile. It oscillates in this grinding band, sometimes dipping into -5% territory, then rebounding to +5%.
Yeah.
And there were historical periods where inflation spiked dramatically. The data shows it sometimes exceeding 30%.
Which completely undermines the foundation of a demographic dividend.
That's what I'm trying to reconcile here. How do you have the perfect demographic setup but experience a 30% inflation spike?
Because a demographic dividend is not an automatic payout. It is strictly an opportunity.
Okay.
It only functions if that massive influx of young working-age people is actually absorbed into highly productive, stable jobs. If the economy cannot generate those jobs, the potential energy is never converted into kinetic economic growth.
That makes sense.
And those inflation spikes you mentioned, they are critical to understand. When inflation hits 30%, it destroys domestic savings.
Right, because the money loses its value.
Exactly. If a household finally managed to save a little surplus capital because they had fewer children, a 30% inflation rate essentially evaporates that wealth overnight. It creates extreme macroeconomic vulnerability.
And as you pointed out, with the old age dependency rising to 14%, this window is actively closing.
Yes.
The generation that was supposed to build the nation's wealth is now moving toward retirement.
Yeah.
And the burden of care will shift to an elderly population, which requires complex, expensive health care.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at what that massive workforce actually did.
Right. So the window opens. We have this unprecedented wave of young, energetic people entering the workforce in the 90s and 2000s. Where did they actually go? Did they stay on the farms?
No. The farms largely emptied out. And this brings us to a structural metamorphosis in how the country generates value. We see a deep fundamental shift toward a service-dominated economy.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the numbers, because the contrast is stark. Agriculture, which was historically this foundational pillar, now employs roughly 19% of the total labor force.
Right.
But when you look at agriculture's value added to the national GDP, it sits stubbornly in the single digits, around 5 to 8%.
That disparity is a glaring diagnostic indicator. I mean, you have nearly a fifth of your working population generating only 5 to 8% of your national wealth.
That's a huge mismatch.
It is. It points to critically low productivity, a lack of technological modernization in farming, and really just subsistence-level wages.
It's like a labor siphon effect. Meanwhile, the service sector has absolutely surged. It now absorbs between 56 and 64% of the total employment. And the value added by services to the GDP has climbed steadily from around 57% historically to over 60%.
Yeah.
It is the undisputed behemoth of their economy.
And we need to define services in this specific geographic context, right?
Yeah.
Because while it includes banking, telecommunications, and retail, a heavily outsized portion of this growth is driven by hospitality, international tourism, and related auxiliary services.
Okay, so they modernized, they recognized their global comparative advantage, their geography, their coastline, their culture, and they built a massive international tourism engine.
Right.
They moved workers out of low-yield agriculture and into air-conditioned hotels and telecommunication centers. I mean, on paper, that is a textbook development victory. But wait, if nearly everyone is moving into services, doesn't that make the economy incredibly rigid or vulnerable to global shocks?
Yes. I wouldn't call it a total victory at all. That is actually a dangerous assumption to make.
Why? I mean, moving from subsistence farming to formal employment with a steady paycheck seems like an undeniable upgrade for a household.
At the individual level, for the person who secures that job, yes. But at the macroeconomic level, what they built is exquisitely fragile.
Okay.
Modernization implies stability. But a service economy so heavily reliant on international tourism introduces severe structural vulnerabilities.
Walk me through the mechanics of that vulnerability.
Let's look at the data on foreign direct investment, or FDI, and official development assistance. The capital required to build a sprawling luxury coastal resort rarely comes from domestic savings.
Especially not in an economy that struggled to capture its demographic dividend, right?
Exactly. It comes from foreign investors.
So a foreign hospitality conglomerate builds the hotel.
Correct. And the local economy benefits from the construction jobs and the ongoing wage labor for the hotel staff.
Sure.
However, the bulk of the corporate profit is repatriated back to the conglomerate's home country. More importantly, this entire economic engine is entirely dependent on the discretionary income of consumers in the global north.
Wow.
If North America or Europe experiences a recession, or if there is a global shock, like a pandemic or a spike in aviation fuel prices, the very first thing households cut is their Caribbean vacation.
Right. The demand side of their economy is located entirely outside their borders.
Exactly. And when that external demand drops, the local impact is devastating.
The hotels empty out.
The hotels empty out, the secondary services, the local food vendors, the tour guides, the transport operators, they all lose their contracts. But there is an internal vulnerability that is equally concerning.
What's that?
By allowing agriculture to hollow out to 5% of GDP, you raise serious questions about national food security.
Right, because if you aren't growing enough food to feed your own population, let alone the millions of tourists flying in, you have to import it.
Which requires foreign currency. And where do you get the foreign currency? From the tourists.
Ah.
It becomes a closed, highly dependent loop. And remember that 19% of the population is still working in agriculture. The massive wealth being generated in the coastal service hubs is not trickling down to them. They are structurally left behind.
Man. So we have an economy that is transitioned heavily into services, heavily reliant on external stability. But you'd think a booming service sector would be the perfect sponge to absorb all those educated young people we talked about earlier.
That is the logical assumption. You have the modern jobs, you have the young demographic. It should be a perfect match.
Right.
But when we cross-reference the labor market data with the specific youth demographic data, the entire narrative fractures.
And this is where we hit the paradox I brought up at the very beginning. Let's look at the NEET rate for the 15 to 24 age bracket. For anyone unfamiliar, NEET stands for not in education, employment, or training.
It measures the human capital that is actively sitting idle.
Right. And the overall NEET rate is startlingly high, often hovering between 20 and 33% overall.
Mm.
But when you split this data by gender, it becomes completely counterintuitive.
Yeah, it really does.
The female youth NEET rates are staggering. They persistently sit between 34 and 38%. Nearly 4 out of 10 young women are completely sidelined.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the friction. When you look at the education data, young women are staying in school longer and completing their secondary education at higher rates than their male counterparts.
Which creates a profound contradiction.
Wait, hold on. So what does this all mean? You're telling me the young women are staying in the education system, doing everything right according to the standard development playbook,
Yeah.
and they are rewarded with a 38% unemployment rate.
Yeah.
That completely breaks the basic rule of economics we are all taught. More school equals better jobs. Why stay in the system if the economy punishes you with those odds?
Because the formal education system and the actual labor market are operating on two completely different frequencies. Let's explore the exact mechanics of why a tourism-driven service economy fails to absorb educated women.
I really want to understand this, because globally, women often dominate service sector employment.
They do, but we have to look at the specific nature of the jobs being created versus the specific nature of the education being provided.
Okay.
A general secondary education might provide a solid foundation in literacy, mathematics, and humanities, but a specialized service economy demands specific technical skills, advanced hospitality management, specific IT proficiencies, or specialized customer relations training that the general school system may not be equipped to provide.
I see.
There is a fundamental skills mismatch.
So they have a diploma, but not the specific certificate the hotel manager needs.
Precisely. And secondly, we have to look at geography. The new service jobs are heavily concentrated in specific coastal hubs or in the capital.
Right.
But the young, educated women are spread across the entire country, including rural parishes. Relocating requires capital for housing and transport, which a recent graduate just doesn't have.
They are geographically trapped.
And then there is the most critical structural barrier, the cultural and logistical expectations of labor. The hospitality industry operates on 24/7 schedules, requiring shift work, weekend hours, and extreme flexibility.
Oh, right.
If a society lacks robust, affordable, state-sponsored childcare, A young woman with a child is instantly, structurally disqualified from those roles. She isn't in the neat category by choice. She is forced there by a lack of social infrastructure.
That is a devastating mechanical failure. The state invested in her education, she put in the years of work, and the economic structure simply refuses to let her participate. It's a double-edged crisis.
It is a severe human capital idle risk.
Okay, so if the girls are staying in school and ending up unemployed, where are the boys? Why is their NEET rate significantly low? I mean, it sits around 20 to 28%.
Because the young men are exiting the formal system entirely. If we look at the education retention data, adolescent males of lower secondary age are dropping out at alarming rates. The data shows out-of-school rates where boys fall severely behind, sometimes showing a 21 to 23% dropout rate compared to females at 17 to 20%.
They are actively abandoning their formal education. But if their NEET rate is lower, it means they are finding something to do.
They are being pulled rapidly into the informal economy.
Cash-in-hand jobs, construction day labor, driving taxis, street vending, informal agriculture, jobs that provide immediate cash but offer zero long-term security, no pensions, and no upward mobility.
Or worse, they are pulled into illicit economies. But to understand why a 14-year-old boy drops out to drive a taxi, we have to look at the financial realities of his household.
Which brings up another contradiction of the data, because it's very easy for an external observer, just looking at this to say, the government just needs to spend more money on schools.
Right, that's the classic response.
But looking at the adjusted savings on education expenditure, the Jamaican state actually spends a robust amount. They consistently allocate roughly 4 to 6.9% of their gross national income to education. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars.
That is a substantial, sustained budgetary commitment. The political will to fund education is clearly present in the macro data.
Wait, so if the government is pouring up to 6% of its gross national income into education, why are we seeing kids acting as unpaid family labor?
And this is where the system breaks down. The data indicates that of the children classified as employed, ages 7 to 14 unpaid family workers make up a massive chunk. We're talking 70 to 80% of employed children.
That's incredible.
And nearly 100% of these employed children are categorized as balancing study and work.
Study and work.
What's fascinating here is the concept of education conversion efficiency.
Explain that.
High spending doesn't automatically equal optimal outcomes if socioeconomic pressures force children to work. This explains how a state can spend 6% of its GNI on schools and still see a massive chunk of its boys drop out.
Walk me through the microeconomics of that. How does the money leak out of the system?
It's an issue of opportunity cost at the household level. Let's imagine a rural farming household. The parents are part of that 19% of the workforce we discussed earlier, generating only 5% of the GDP.
Right.
Their profit margins are virtually non-existent. Now, the state has done its job. It built a secondary school 3 miles away and pays the teachers.
So the supply side is functioning.
Yes. But on the demand side, the family, the economic reality is brutal. They cannot afford to hire outside labor to help with the harvest or to tend livestock. Therefore, the physical labor of their 13-year-old son is an immediate, non-negotiable economic necessity for the family's survival.
So he wakes up at, 4:30 a.m.? He works the field or loads goods for a market stall. Then he puts on his uniform and goes to school.
He sits in a classroom for 6 hours, already physically exhausted. He returns home and works until sundown. The data explicitly states these children are trying to balance study and work.
Right.
But cognitive capacity is a finite resource. You cannot absorb a complex mathematics lesson when you are physically drained and stressed about your family's daily survival.
Of course not. His academic performance degrades.
Slowly but surely. He falls behind. The frustration builds. The classroom becomes a place of failure, while the informal economy where he can earn actual cash by helping load a truck or driving a route offers immediate validation and financial relief.
Yeah.
The opportunity cost of sitting in a classroom simply becomes too high for the family to bear, and he drops out.
So the state's investment in his desk and his teacher is rendered entirely inefficient.
Exactly, because the household lacks the baseline economic security to allow him to simply be a student.
Wow. So the social fabric is clearly struggling under the weight of these macroeconomic contradictions. But, and I think we need to pivot here, if we look at the pure logistics, the physical infrastructure data tells a completely different, almost triumphant story. We have to celebrate the wins.
It does, and as objective analysts, we have to examine where the state apparatus has functioned with high efficiency.
Let's look at basic utilities. Hitting 100% electricity access is huge.
Hmm.
If you track the historical data from the 70s and 80s into the 90s, there were significant gaps, particularly in rural parishes. Closing that gap to 100% in recent years is a monumental logistical achievement.
It completely alters the baseline of human capability. It means refrigeration for medicine and food security. It means connectivity to the digital economy.
And access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking skyrocketed to roughly 93%. Transitioning a population away from burning raw wood or charcoal indoors to using liquid petroleum gas, I mean, that might sound trivial to someone in a developed nation, but it is a massive public health victory.
It really is. It drastically reduces particulate inhalation, directly improving respiratory health, particularly for women and children who historically spend more time in the domestic cooking environment.
And speaking of health, the epidemiological data here shows a fascinating transition.
It shows the classic markers of an economy that has moved past the initial stages of development. The data indicates that non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancers, now account for an overwhelming 72 to 79% of total deaths.
Which means fewer people are dying from infectious diseases or malnutrition, which were the hallmarks of earlier eras.
Exactly. It's a byproduct of longer life expectancy, that rising old age dependency ratio we discussed, combined with modernized, often more sedentary lifestyles and changes in diet.
Right.
But we also have to acknowledge their success in combating specific infectious crises.
No.
The HIV data provided here is a testament to effective intervention.
The incidence rate dropped significantly. New adult infections fell from a peak of around 3,200 annually down to roughly 910. And antiretroviral therapy coverage grew from 0% to 54%.
When you map that curve, it shows that the state, often in partnership with international NGOs, is highly capable of executing targeted logistical campaigns.
Yeah.
They can distribute medicine, they can run testing protocols, they can string electrical wire across mountainous terrain.
So the state can execute on logistics, they can build the grid and distribute the pills. Where they struggle is with the structural, behavioral puzzles, like how to align a secondary school curriculum with a hotel hiring manager's needs.
That is a very accurate synthesis. Engineering problems have linear solutions. You allocate capital and hire contractors. Socioeconomic problems require re-engineering the market and human behavior, which is infinitely more complex.
But powering that 100% electrical grid and running those massive resorts requires energy. And this is where the ledger goes deep into the red. We have to look at the environmental toll.
Because the modernization we've been discussing has a heavy physical cost.
Despite the clean cooking fuels improving the air inside the home, the outdoor environmental damage is quietly eating away at the national wealth. The data tracks population exposure to PM 2.5 particulate matter pollution. And the figures show that 47 to 57% of the population is regularly exposed to air pollution levels that exceed World Health Organization's safety thresholds.
And the World Bank actually calculates the financial cost of this health damage. It isn't just an abstract ecological metric.
Right. The particulate emission damage costs the economy tens of millions of dollars annually. People are getting sick.
Which means missed days of work, increased burden on the healthcare system, and a persistent drag on macroeconomic productivity.
And the carbon dioxide damage is even higher. The data shows CO2 damage consistently eating up between 1.5 and 2.6% of the gross national income. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in damages, reaching over $359 million in recent data.
It's massive.
And the reason becomes painfully obvious when you look at the national energy mix. Fossil fuel energy consumption makes up an overwhelming 87 to 92% of their total energy use.
Yeah.
Alternative and renewable energy fluctuates in a tiny band. It barely hits 5 to 14%, with specific alternative and nuclear metrics hovering around 0.2% to barely over 2%.
It is a massive vulnerability.
I have to ask the obvious question here. We are talking about an island nation in the Caribbean. They have intense year-round tropical sun. They are surrounded by ocean winds.
Right.
The geographic potential for renewable energy is infinite. Why on earth are they importing expensive oil to run their grid? Why are they so locked into fossil fuels? Why not just build solar farms?
Because of the economic mechanics of energy infrastructure. You're describing a phenomenon known as high carbon lock-in.
Explain the mechanics of that lock-in. Why can't they just transition?
This raises an important question about capital. It comes down to the difference between capital expenditure CapEx and operational expenditure OpEx. The sun and the wind are free, but the specialized infrastructure required to capture them at a national scale, the solar arrays, the turbines, and, crucially, the massive grid-scale battery storage needed to provide consistent power when the sun goes down that requires an astronomical upfront capital expenditure.
You need billions of dollars on day one.
Exactly. Now, remember the macroeconomic data we discussed earlier. The low oscillating GDP growth, the historical inflation spikes.
Yeah.
When a developing nation goes to the international financial markets to borrow billions of dollars for a solar grid, they are charged incredibly high interest rates because they are viewed as a higher risk. The cost of capital is prohibitive.
So they literally can't afford the capex.
Which forces them to rely on OpEx. It is much cheaper in the short term to maintain existing legacy fossil fuel generators and simply buy shipments of oil every month.
Ah, I see.
You are paying a premium over time, and you are subjecting your economy to the wild volatility of global oil prices, but you avoid the massive upfront debt.
It's the poverty trap applied to national infrastructure. It's like buying a luxury car on a credit card with a 30% interest rate. You get to drive the car, you get the 100% electricity access, but the monthly interest payments eat up the cash you needed to send your kids to college.
That is a perfect analogy, and we have to connect this back to the service economy. Those massive coastal resorts and international airports demand intense, highly reliable 24/7 baseload power.
Right.
An international resort cannot have its air conditioning shut down because a cloud passed over the solar farm. Historically, the only way to guarantee that level of reliability on an island was to burn heavy fuel oil.
So the very economic miracle that modernized the country was built entirely on a foundation of imported carbon.
And they are now physically and economically locked into it. Furthermore, the governance data in this set highlights the difficulty of managing these transitions.
What does the governance data show?
The percentiles for control of corruption generally oscillate between 30 and 61%. And the rule of law ranks in the 36 to 51% range.
Which indicates a lot of institutional friction.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to orchestrate a massive national transition away from fossil fuels or reform the entire education system to match the labor market, you need highly efficient, transparent state institutions.
You need absolute governance capability to manage foreign investments and ensure that the wealth generated by the service sector is aggressively reinvested into rural infrastructure and technical education. Without that, you hit a systemic bottleneck.
It is a staggering, interconnected web. Everything we've discussed over the last hour is inextricably linked.
Completely.
Let's summarize this. The shift to a tourism-led service economy demands exponentially more power. Because of high borrowing costs, that power relies on imported fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels create PM2.5 pollution and CO2 damages that drain hundreds of millions of dollars from the GNI. That financial drain leaves the government with less flexible capital to fortify the social safety net. Without that safety net, rural families are forced to rely on child labor to survive, which directly leads to adolescent boys dropping out of school.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, the girls who stay in school graduate into a labor market that demands highly specific technical skills or impossible shift schedules without childcare support, leaving nearly 40% of them sidelined.
It is a single breathing ecosystem. Knowledge is most valuable when we view these not as isolated data points, but as a holistic picture. You cannot isolate the energy policy from the youth unemployment crisis. If you try to analyze these data points in a vacuum, you will fundamentally misunderstand the nation.
Yeah.
The goal of this kind of data analysis is to reveal those hidden causal links.
It truly changes how you look at the mechanics of a country.
Yeah.
And it certainly changes how you look at a tourist brochure.
It really does.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a question to mull over on your own. If a nation successfully achieves the logistical triumphs of modern development, building a multi-billion-dollar service economy, capturing a demographic dividend, securing 100% electricity access, and defeating historical public health crises, but in doing so, becomes tethered to a high-carbon energy lock-in, and leaves a third of its educated young women entirely unemployed, while young men fall out of the system entirely. How should we redefine what true development actually means for the 21st century?